My name is Michael Guyot, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Andrey Sizov. Andrey, for those who are not familiar with your background, introduce yourself. Who are you? How'd you get involved, interested in the agricultural markets? And what are you doing now?
Currently, I'm in Spain, where I've been living for a couple of years. I issue a Sizov report with my team. We also call Sovi Corn. We've been in this space for more than 2 decades, covering mainly wheat and corn with a focus on the Black Sea. We help funds, traders, millers, consumers to understand what's happening with those markets and what potential shocks and disruptions could come out of this region. And unfortunately, we see that quite often, especially in recent years.
How's the interest been among the institutional clients, prospects for your research post Russia going into Ukraine? I have to assume that there's been a lot more intrigue and curiosity around the ag space.
Yeah, of course it did. So that's a pretty important region. First of all, for wheat, Russia and Ukraine accounts for around 1/3 of total of global wheat trade, Russia being the biggest supplier by far. And also it's important supplier of corn. Ukraine is quite a noticeable supplier, competing quite actively, for example, with the US corn in China. And actually, Ukraine has been the biggest supplier for China with its corn for a couple of years prior to the recent season. And taking that into account, yes, when the invasion started and we saw what happened. I think it was 5 sessions or 6 sessions in a row when we saw limit up in Chicago. And yes, indeed, obviously, it generated a lot of interest in our service and our analysis.
Take us through the start of the war to now. How did farmers in Russia and Ukraine respond and react? Was it just sort of a situation of business as usual, or were there certain things that Russia on the government side would do to help things move along on the farming front?
Okay, so no, for farmers, if we talk about Russia, for farmers, it wasn't a big deal. Obviously, it was a big shock, I think, for 99% of Russian people. Some supported that, some part of Russian population, probably 70% actually don't know what to think about it and don't have a clear understanding what's happening. A small share is again that war. But for business, when you're a farmer, you have to seed your crops, you have to harvest your crops, you have a lot of stuff, especially, for example, in the spring when the war started. And yes, so majority of them were carrying and are carrying, doing business as usual. There was a lot of concern about availability of inputs, availability of machinery. Then it was the draft, which also was a problem for farmers. But for Russia, it's not really a big deal. Obviously, it was a way bigger problem for Ukrainian farmers, because if we look at map, first Russia invaded in southeastern Ukraine, and all southern Ukraine near the Black Sea, it's big Ukrainian wheat belt. It grows almost all its wheat there. And then also, as you might remember, Russia tried to capture Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, and it's northern, central Ukraine. And that part is very important for late crops like sunflower and corn. So, yeah, it was lots of problem for Ukrainian farmers, fertilizer availability, just actually shooting mines, then draft again, but they issued a decree that Ukrainian farmers were free not to go to the war to conduct their business, because for Ukraine, agriculture is a very important part of the economy. It accounts for 10% of their GDP and very important source of hard currency, which is double important currently because of all those economic problems Ukraine currently face, where their GDP fell around 1/3 last year. And hard currency, which they get from agricultural exports, are very important, because for Russia, it's mainly oil and gas, agriculture around 4% of total GDP and agricultural exports are not that important. But for Ukraine, it's a very, very important source of hard currency revenue.
Has it been surprising to you that there's been a sort of reduction of that war premium? A lot of the initial reaction to Russia going into Ukraine when it comes to the wheat markets, comes to the corn markets, a lot of that has kind of gone round trip, right? So has that been surprising? Why is it that the price has not been elevated for longer?
For us, it wasn't really surprising, I would say, and hopefully for our clients. So basically what was happening in the very beginning, so it's late March, the invasion started on 24th of February, late February, early March, the market was just crazy, wheat market rallied around 50% in just a few weeks. As I said, I think it was 5 or 6 sessions, limit up sessions in a row. That was probably a record. So the market, so not many understood what was happening. The market at the beginning was pricing in. I think that probably we won't see any exports coming out of the Black Sea regions anytime soon. And that wasn't a really accurate estimate of what was happening because Ukrainian ports, they were closed down relatively fast. Ukraine closed them down itself, not to allow Russia to attack, for example, Odessa and ports nearby. So it was put on halt. But at the same time, Russian Black Sea terminals were operating with just a temporary short stop, I think for a week, maybe 2 weeks maximum. And then they start to export grain wheat mainly quite actively. And taking that into account, it looked like overreaction. I should also probably add that, the setup was very bullish at that time. In addition to that, to the fact that Russia went into Ukraine, funds managed money. They were very short in mid-February, so they have to get rid of those shorts fast, and that really added fuel to the fire. So after that, we see a peak around, I think, April. And after that, we just discussed that recently again. After that, in May, we saw the Economist magazine cover, which was very impressive cover with grains and skulls, saying it was called, I think, Coming Food Catastrophe. And after that, the market started to tank. And it's still actually prices are falling. And now I would say we feel that market is underestimating the situation, underestimating the risks that we have globally because of Black Sea supplies. And now just reversed. Earlier, they were all overestimating those risks, and now they're underestimating those risks. It's very likely to be extended. We were quite optimistic about the previous term, which ended in November, and we were right. And we were expecting that was a high chance that would be extended 1-2 weeks ago. But after China openly supported that extension, and China probably currently is the biggest, I won't say ally, but the biggest Russian partner at the moment. And they openly, just on Friday, supported grain corridor extension. I think we can say probably that it's almost a done deal. So I think just to answer your question, so it should be breaking down into several blocks. So there is Ukraine, there is Russia, and grain corridor, it covers only shipments of Ukrainian grain. So it's not relevant, at least directly, to Russian shipments, which continue if there is a grain corridor or if there is no grain corridor. That's one point. Another point, when we talk about payments, which you mentioned, it's not a problem for Ukraine. Payments, again, they're payments, there are no sanctions against Ukraine, obviously. But yes, it was a problem for Russia. Many Russian banks were cut off from the SWIFT, and as we saw just last week again, more banks are being kicked off the SWIFT system. Yes, and that was a problem. Some banks still operate, so you can get payments. Then you have problems with insurance. Then compliance issues. Companies now spend not just a few days, but a month checking their Russian counterparties, it all slows down the flow of goods. Yes, and it was the problem for Russian exports, but it's not really the biggest problem. If you think about Russian exports, the biggest problem is infrastructure bottlenecks, which Russia had, which Russia still has, and which got worse because of military operation, because rail it's serving military shipments first of all, and everything goes after that, and that's the biggest problem for Russian exports at the moment. So for Ukraine, it's different story. It's one region, but very different story. For Ukraine, no problems with payment, but problems with grain corridor. And again, mention logistics. While those terminals in Odessa region, 3 deep sea terminals, Ukrainian terminals, were shut down, Ukraine did a good job by trying to switch. Obviously, as you probably know quite well, sea deliveries are the cheapest ones, but they tried to switch. They tried to ship more via rail, via trucks to the EU, to Romania, to Hungary, to Poland. Some of those crops stayed in the EU. Some were exported via Romania, first of all. But the problem is when we talk about logistics for Ukraine and why it was still quite slowly, I think they were doing 1.5 million tons a month, while Odessa terminals were shut down, where in peaceful times they can easily ship almost 6 million tons a month. Problem for those land logistics was that Ukraine, as many other countries, as Baltic states, for example, they have different type of rail gauge compared to the EU. So you just can't load a train with Ukrainian wheat and send it to Romania, to Constanta, to ship it on the grain over there, because you have to either unload that grain to another on the Romanian side, and that takes a lot of time, and that is painfully slow, and that's why it was very important for Ukraine to open up these terminals. And if you talk about logistics, fortunately for Ukraine, so Ukraine, Russia, they share the same seas, Black Sea, obviously, and the Azov Sea. Russia quite fast captured that region around Azov Sea, part of Ukraine. But fortunately for Ukraine, its all main terminals are not there. Azov Sea, it's a shallow sea. Their main terminals, deep sea terminals, they're all in western part of the country, southwestern part of the country, 3 terminals in Odessa, 2 terminals in Mykolaiv, and it's not controlled by Russia now. And that's why they can ship their grain quite fast. You mean planting of fall 2023? Okay. So, a lot of could and probably will change by fall 2023. Optimistic scenario, this war could be over, or at least put on some halt. Yes, you are right about huge carryover stocks in Russia because of that record high crop that the country had last year. And experts are going relatively fast now. They're actually going at maximum, but we have infrastructure bottlenecks we talked about. Then we have typical weather problems, which Black Sea has during winter, like storms. And that was a big problem for Russian terminals in February. And just on top of that, we had floating mines in the Black Sea because of storms that were torn off the seabed and were floating around the Black Sea. And yes, and we should also add that partly because of the problems you talked about with payments and things like that, but mainly because Russian wheat actually was not really competitive in the beginning of this season, which starts for this region in July, and exports were relatively slow for such huge crop in July, August, September, October, and they started to pick up only after that. So taking all that into account, Russia will have likely to have record high exports with export this season. But still, yes, the inventory will be huge. We believe it will be record high for at least post-Soviet times. Farmers now are very unhappy with current prices. They're more or less flat inside the country. And to make things worse for farmers, I should also add that in 2021, and it was a huge game changer for Russian farmers, I think, bigger than the start of this war. In 2021, Russian government introduced a very strict grain export tax, which covers wheat, corn, and barley. And that export tax means that while in the EU, farmers could sell their wheat roughly for 300 euros. In the US, for example, $7.5 per bushel. In Russia, they're selling their wheat for less than now for around $180, $170 per ton, which is roughly less than 5 bushels, $5 per bushel. And while agricultural input prices are higher, and that does obviously hurt farmers' P&L. Russia is a big country and margins are very different. For example, in Russian South, margins are still in positive territory and still relatively high. But if we look further to the east, so for example, Volga Valley, Urals, Siberia, the far we're getting from European part of Russia, from central Russia to the east, the lower margins were, and now we believe with all that, which I just spoken, huge stocks, relatively low prices, inputs are gradually going up, margins are going down. Yes, there is a big question mark over the next crop, not 2023, but 2024. And actually, this year prior to this crop, so they were in wheat, Russian farmers last fall, and actually area has declined substantially by around 1 million hectares, so roughly 5% year on year. It's not such a big decline, and actually just got back to average because it was very high area prior to that. But yeah, we see that the winter wheat area, and for Russia, winter wheat accounts for around 70% of total production. It's already declining, and so huge stocks, low prices, that very strict export tax, it's likely to accelerate during next years, and we're very likely to see a smaller crop this year in Russia, and we're very likely to see even smaller crop in 2024. So yes, your point is very valid. No. As I said, the area has declined substantially by around 1 million hectares. It's 2.5 million acres. Yeah, so that's a big decline. But, now it's not very low. It just got back to average. Before that, it was very high area. Now it's average. But with all that, we're likely to see a further decline in the future. While Russian farmers probably will try and will be forced to switch to other crops, like very more niche crops, like lentils, like peas, for example, which are not taxed. That's an important point. No, it's a widespread thing. So we saw that many companies said we're pulling out of Russia after February 2022, and Deal and Apcar, so global machinery produce 1 and 2, they pulled out. Fortunately for Russian farmers, they're not the biggest suppliers of machinery in Russia. It's some local producers, then German Claas, it has a plant inside Russia. So yes, it's a problem, but not really a big one, because those large guys, they're not really important inside Russia. And also we see parallel input, so-called, so not official input going via other countries. So farmers still can get spare parts, but it's way more expensive. Now, what we can say, it's not availability, but the prices. The prices, they just skyrocketed, not only because of weak ruble. Ruble now is has been collapsing in recent weeks, but because of more sophisticated logistical routes. And yes, that's the problem. But probably, I think, a bigger problem, not the machinery, we talk about inputs in Russia, but I think probably crop protection and probably seeds are even more important, particularly for corn and sunflower. Sunflower is a huge cash crop. that part of the world.
Let me reset the room for the remaining minutes. Everybody, please make sure you follow Andrey Sizov here on Twitter. Make sure you check out the Sizov report. What would cause another spike higher, Andrey? I mean, if we took out the war premium, I mean, we can debate whether or not the war is going to end sooner or not, but or there's any escalation. But what would cause another real price shock in the entire ag space?
So the Black Sea could be once again a big source because it's kind of so the market now is trading, in our view, if we talk about wheat and actually also about corn, in our view, and I'm talking about Chicago now, prices are below their fundamental values currently. And at the same time, there is still war and everything could happen during that war. I don't know. For example, just a rocket hitting terminal in Ukraine, which could happen unintentionally. For example, a rocket, again, a missile, again, flying into Romania or into Poland, which it was just a speculation, as we saw just, I think, 2 weeks ago, when Kyiv said that a Russian missile entered Romanian space and reminded Romania not a member. It wasn't confirmed, but the market rallied. Then we might remember the case in late 2022 when it was again Russian missile it was reported Russian missile landed in Poland, hit Polish farm, killed 2 people. Then it was found out that probably it was a Ukrainian missile which was trying to shut down the Russian missile. But again, the market rallied at that time. Then I'm just reminding what was happening in recent months. Then probably in October last year, President Putin said that Russia pulling out of the grain deal quite unexpectedly. Actually, we were warning our clients about that. But and again, quite even more unexpectedly, he returned to that deal in a few days. So again, fundamentally, wheat and corn are cheap currently, we believe, especially wheat. And there is still Russia and Black Sea, the whole is a huge supply. And the export program, both Russia and Ukraine, it hasn't been done fully by now. Russia is around 70%, Ukraine around 75% of the export program for the current season. And so global grain S&D relies a lot on those supplies from Black Sea. Obviously, it's not the only supply. We have, for example, huge Australian wheat crop, but it's still a very important supply, and there is a war over there, and a lot of things could happen during the war. So I hope it answers your question. If not, just let me know.
No, that's good. And are there typically sort of early speculators that speculative activity that you tend to see in advance of these types of potential spikes? I mean, presumably there are always going to be those traders that think that something major is coming or imminently coming, and would respond off of that by moving price in advance. Do you track speculative positioning there?
Not really. Actually, it's quite interesting. So let me not directly, but answer your question and your comment not directly. So as I said, fundamentally, S&D is tight. There is a war in the Black Sea, but and a lot could happen because this war definitely is not over, and we're likely to see escalation during probably next few months. There were speculation talks that Russia would start a large offensive. Probably it's not starting that large offensive everyone was talking about, but what is more probable and quite likely is that Ukraine will start its large counteroffensive in several months, and so the situation will become more tense, war risk will become bigger, but at the same time, and again, back to your comment about speculators, at the same time, what we see, unfortunately, we haven't seen port reports, commitment of traders reports for weeks, but what we see now, at least private estimates, the net short interest in wheat by the funds, now is close to record high. Probably something around 100,000 contracts, which is a huge number for wheat. And so if everything happens substantial, we could see a rally which could be compared to the start of this war. Even despite that event could be not as big, but because of those 100,000 short positions, we could see just an explosion.
Okay, hold on. So that actually is interesting to me. So how long have those shorts been building up? I mean, so in a lot of these spaces on Twitter, people will talk about short squeezes when it comes to the stock market, but a short squeeze when it comes to food to agriculture
Yeah.
is a whole nother dynamic, right? That has real world
Yeah.
complications.
Yeah. So I think they've been building since probably I don't remember, but for several months already, from probably third quarter 2022. So they were short, but not as the short wasn't as big as now in February a year ago. Then they got neutral. Then they had a long position. If we talk about funds. And then after that, probably around April, not May, I don't remember honestly, but I think around third quarter of the previous year, they started to increase their short position.
And you said that's primarily in the wheat side. What about corn and other agriculture futures?
No, in corn and beans and meal, they're still long. They've been, as I recall, they've been lowering their position. But in wheat, and that's the problem with Chicago wheat. I'm talking about Chicago wheat specifically, because of that, because funds increasing their shorts constantly. Chicago wheat has been quite detached from fundamentals, and as I said, that's one of the reasons. And if something bad happens, it just would see just an enormous rally. So I partly agree, because this season, we see relatively strong Ukrainian experts because Green Corridor thing is working, and we see those relatively strong experts. Probably they will do around up to almost 40 million tons, 36, 35 corn and wheat. And they're exporting despite a relatively poor crop. And they can do that because they had a huge carry-in stocks from the previous year. Because previous year, 2021, they had a record high crop, is probably you might remember. But looking at the next season, we'll see lower carry-in, and we expect to see even low. It's too early to talk about corn at this stage because it's will depend a lot on the war. But we'll see. We have our estimate of next Ukrainian crop around 18 million tons compared to 20 million tons in the previous year, and that's a very low crop. So next season, lower crop won't be offset by high carry-in as it's happening in the current season. So yes, your point is correct, but I don't agree that it's kind of likely to last for many years, and we should get used to lower supply from Ukraine, because we just saw this season how resilient Ukrainian farmers are, and actually they produced way more than many were expecting, way more than Ukraine was officially forecasting, because it was just like decline of 50, 60%, something like that. And they, despite the war, despite just fighting in 10, 20 kilometers, they were still harvesting their crops. And I think, so again, a lot depends on what happened to Ukraine in the future. If it's a peaceful, free territory, I think it could recover, at least its agriculture could recover quite fast. Maybe not in a year, but in a couple of years, and they can again produce lots of corn, threaten U.S. supplies to China, and so I do believe they're very resilient. So yes, so you know that probably better. Chinese-U.S. relations not really rosy, especially recently. China, it has been buying a lot of Ukrainian corn. I think it's still in place. They had a long-term agreement, actually, which is very unfavorable for Ukraine, to that they are obliged to offer their corn to China. And that deal is still in place. China is looking for other supplies in addition or instead of the US, of soybeans and corn. And corn, probably Brazil is even a bigger story, which we see growing number of shipments of Brazilian corn going to China, and started just recently. China approved Brazilian supplies of of corn. So, but, if we get to second question, if I got it correctly, I don't really think that, Ukrainian corn specifically is such a big deal for such an important case when we talk about reaching some kind of settlement in that region. China clearly, for me, wants to play peace broker role in this conflict. So probably early it was Turkey, which was number one player trying to arrange some kind of peace. And now it looks like, Turkey is busy with its own problems. Now China tries to play that role. But, grains and corn are not really that important in my view. But actually, I should also add that China, it has indeed growing economical ties with Russia. They're not as big as people may think. I mean, for example, let's get to soybeans. I think that's a funny example. So for Russia, China is the biggest buyer of its soybeans. Russia also exports some soybeans. Around 100% of Russia's soybeans goes to China. For China, Russia's supplies is less than 1% of their total soybeans imports. So here's how their economic cooperation looks like. So China and economical ties with Russia, is growing. And just shortly before February 24 last year, China actually approved Russia as supplier of wheat and corn. Now, all Russian regions could supply their wheat and corn to China. Some corn shipments now are going from Russian Far East to China. But again, for China, it's negligible volumes at this stage. But quite interestingly, there are no supplies of Russian wheat to China, at least in noticeable volumes. But that could change in the future. But again, it's kind of too small story compared to whole this war and Chinese role in that war. Cool. So you described all the possible scenarios. It's the best one and the worst one. So I just disclaimer, I'm not a military expert. But we follow very closely what's happening in Russia with draft force mobilization, how much troops it has, can we see an escalation and when. So I'm taking that into account and looking at Russian economic potential and military potential, looking at Ukrainian military and economic potential, but adding to that potential of NATO countries, of US, of the EU. We believe that long-term, obviously, Russian potential is way smaller. So among other things, I would say that I mentioned that earlier, at least short-term, I doubt that Russia has accumulated enough for somewhere to start a large focused offensive. One point. Second point, so when we talk about Odessa, south eastern Ukraine, and covering all the Black Sea, I think it's in my view clearly Russia doesn't have enough forces, enough troops to do that. So basically, I think a reasonable assumption would be, more probable scenario would be that it could be some kind of truce, peaceful agreement between Russia and Ukraine. My guess would be somewhere closer to the end of the current year. U.S. president is facing his re-election the year after. And so Russia also, Putin, he will again go to elections in 2024 as well. And they need to somehow, I think, just to say, if even Russia doesn't win anything substantial there, Putin can say, I don't know, we reached our goals, because fortunately for him, or probably it's done on purpose, those goals are very unclear. Ukraine, okay, I'm not sure that it's 100 achievable goal, but they say we want Russia out of our borders, and after that we'll talk to them and want them out of our borders and to get back to the borders of 1991. That's a clear and understandable goal. But when we talk about Russia, there are many different goals, and they're very unclear, which, among other things, will allow Putin, I don't know, somewhere in the second half of the year, when he sees that he can win more regions, more territory, would say, okay, we reached our goals, we won, let's get back home. That's quite probably in my view. So it's hard to say, but in my view, it's very unlikely that Russia would be able, quite unlikely, be able to capture a lot of more Ukrainian territory. Probably they would be lucky to keep what they currently control, I would say that. While if you talk about Ukraine and their forthcoming quite probable counteroffensive, Ukraine obviously doesn't like that, and probably if you look at the map, again, those Russians and southeastern Ukraine and Crimea, and there's a land corridor connecting main Russia to Crimea, and probably what Ukraine will try to do, it will try to cut that corridor, so the Crimea will be served only by Crimean bridge and vessels, and that will make Russian defenses very challenging, similar to what, for example, we saw in Kherson city. So just a guess, the war could be over this year. Probably that could be quite optimistic, but at least we see that close to the end of this year, the parties will be forced to start talking, both Russia and Ukraine. And I do doubt that Russia will be able to capture a lot more territory. And so I don't hope this answers your question, but it's what I think as of today. So just, there are many scenarios, but though obviously the West doesn't want to push Putin too hard, those red lines, nuclear threats. Obviously, West is not happy with that, but at the same time, the West does want to show Putin that he can't win. So we have to take that kind of. I think that's a major trend, and somewhere mixing them, there will be a solution. Again, I think it will be the chance quite high that it will be renewed. At the same time, probably I think you implied that, and it was kind of popular, thinking that, Russia had to return to that grain deal because it understood that it could run without its participation. And I don't agree with that because, for example, I guess Russia won't be attacking vessels, especially under the Turkish flag. But if Russia is out of that initiative, one of the clauses say that Russia can't attack grain infrastructure, ports infrastructure, but just Russia just can get back to attacking terminal infrastructure, and everything will put on halt. And that emergency fund, I don't think it will help. But again, I think that's very unlikely, at least at this stage. And about that emergency insurance fund, I didn't look at it in details, but I think that's a good initiative because obviously it lowers costs for all participants, traders, farmers getting better prices as a result. So yes, I think that's very good. I don't know what the Kremlin will do. And, we made also a lot of mistakes trying to understand to assess what they're doing and that's a possibility. I mean, for example, they can say, just take out the ships and we'll just send in drones over there. I don't know. But yeah, so my point is, and I won't get back to it. So despite what Kyiv keeps saying, and despite that's some kind of optimism, Russia still has a lot of troops, has a lot of military force, naval force in the Black Sea. And I think it can find a way to disrupt those supplies if it wants to.
I think that's probably a good place to wrap this Twitter space up. Everybody, again, please make sure you follow Andrey Sizov here on Twitter. Andrey, for those who are interested in getting a deeper dive on your research, how do they find your work?
Thanks, Mike. You should go, follow me on Twitter, and you should check our website. It's Sizov Report, SIZOV.report, and you can get a free trial and to understand what we cover, how we cover, to get access to our analysts, and to be sure that probably you won't be shocked by any events happening in the Black Sea. that could disrupt global wheat and corn markets. Again, Sizov.report.
The key word in this industry is always probably.
Yeah.
As you correctly said. It's like
Yeah.
you never can tell the future exactly. It's always about probabilities. Thank you, everybody.